Squid Game. Probably doesn't need much of an introduction. This Korean death game drama has completely taken over the world. Everybody's obsessed with it, myself included. And of course, when you're obsessed with something, you do what any sane person would do in this situation. You write an entire rule set for Squid Game in D&D. So being the forever GM that I am, I decided to try to make the most interesting, intense, heart-pounding game of Squid Game with the D&D 5e rule set. So sit back, kick your feet up, and let's make ourselves a Squid Game. But before we do that, if you guys like this video, like the rule set, want to try it out for yourself, there will be a link in the description, take you to my Discord. The entire rule set will be laid out there for you to copy paste using your own maybe Squid Gamey one-shot Halloween session thing, whatever the hell you want to do with it, I don't care. Oh hey, Editor Meta from the future here. Just a quick side note, since I don't mention it at all in the entirety of this video, there are going to be massive spoilers for Squid Game. The entire show is going to be spoiled for you, so if you have not seen it yet and you are watching this, go watch the show. I don't even know why you're here if you haven't seen this show yet, but go watch that, then come back here. Okay, let's go back to the present. So before we jump into the actual games themselves, let's talk about some ground rules needed to make your game of Squid Game fun, balanced, and most importantly, realistic. Every player starts out as a commoner, meaning they have 10 for all of their stats, which is the entire idea behind the Squid Games, as they are meant to be fair competitions with nobody having one leg up over the other. Now, alternatively, if you really feel like it, which could produce some interesting results, you could use an alternative point buy system, kind of how point buy works now, except it's just a 1-to-1 ratio. So you could have like 10 strength, 8 dex, 12 con, 10 wisdom, 6 intelligence, and 14 charisma. As long as the total number of stats equals 60, you would just diversify all of your stats, of course, to a maximum of 20. Even more alternatively, if you really want to just drag and drop this kind of thing into your own campaign, you can use normal D&D characters. However, I would probably advise against it, as this entire rule set I'm about to line out for you is balanced around everybody being a commoner. Rule number 2, just like in the show, players who fail each game are killed immediately. There are no exceptions to this. You are not going to have a bard roll a 20 on a charisma check to get the guard to not kill him. Players are killed when they lose the game. That's the entire nature of Squid Game. That is rule number 2. Rule number 3, just like in the show, anyone who refuses to play the game is eliminated, i.e. killed. Pretty simple, right? So with all those little rules out of the way, we can talk about the games themselves. So we can start right off with the very first game in the show. No, I am not talking about red light, green light. I am talking about Ddakji. If you'll remember, Ddakji is the game that Gi-hoon plays with the recruiter in the very first episode of the show, when he attempts to recruit Gi-hoon to the Squid Games. A recap of the rules: each player takes a colored folded piece of paper, either red or blue, places it on the ground. The other player takes their folded piece of paper and attempts to spike it on the other piece of paper in order to flip the paper. In the show's case, the recruiter would give Gi-hoon 100,000 won every time he won a round of the game. And if the recruiter won, he would slap Gi-hoon in the face, which happened a couple dozen times. So in terms of how you would play this, each player of Ddakji will make 3 separate skill checks to determine the result of their throw. The GM, of course, is going to come up with the DC. The checks are going to be athletics, which is going to basically represent how much strength you put into your throw, followed up by a perception check and an acrobatics check at the same time to measure your character's hand-eye coordination at the moment of the throw. If the total sum of all 3 checks beats the combined DC, the player wins the round. The GM, again, decides how many rounds should be played. Now, I would say this is the only game you could probably implement into your D&D game, whatever it would be, without having the threat of death attached to it. This could be the game that your party gets recruited with, just like in the show. But due to how short and simple this game is, I'd recommend using this as sort of a practice round more than an actual, kill your party after they fail it kind of round. So now we will move on to the actual games in Squid Game themselves, starting with red light, green light. So in the show, red light, green light involves all of the contestants trying to run across a large field, while the doll at the end of the field calls out green light and red light. The contestants may only move during the green light phase of the round and freeze completely still while red light is active. Reaching the goal before the time runs out is the win condition, but if a player is caught moving during the red light cycle, they lose, and are shot on sight. Being the game with the highest kill count in the Squid Games, I tried to make this as tense of a game as possible, and this is what I came up with. Now, it should also be mentioned that while some of these games that will be on this list could be played with theater of the mind, for this game specifically, it is highly recommended that you use some sort of game board. It's going to be really important if you don't want to drive yourself crazy. So before the game begins, the GM decides how much distance can be safely covered during each green light cycle. So, i.e., 15 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, etc. This number should be different on every cycle. So the GM will just have a number in their head. It'll change per round. At the start of the game, during each red light phase, the players will then choose a certain amount of distance they want to travel. This amount will then be locked in by the players and cannot be changed until the next red light cycle. If the amount of movement they choose ends up being under the safe amount threshold, they will automatically succeed in moving, and they will not be shot on the red light callout. So if the player decides to move 25 feet and the safe threshold is chosen as 30 feet, they're fine. But if the player's chosen distance exceeds the safe threshold of movement, i.e. the safe threshold is 25 and they decide to move 30 feet, this will cause them to roll a dexterity saving throw. They must succeed on this dexterity saving throw with the DC increasing the further away they are from the threshold, which you, the GM, can choose whatever number you feel necessary to increase it by, but it should be harder the further they try to move from the safe zone. Failing the saving throw will cause them to move during the red light cycle and they will die. Players can also, if they want to risk it, choose to dash, doubling the distance they travel, causing them to have to play less rounds of the game, but they will also get disadvantage on the saving throw when they inevitably exceed the safe threshold. It should also be mentioned by this point, since I didn't mention it in the intro, you probably want a lot of players for this. Like at least 10 or more players. People will likely get killed pretty fast, and you really want to see how this game ends, I promise. So for some tips as a GM when creating your own red light, green light with these rules, it is advised, as I said before, to use a game board to track the progress of each player, otherwise you'll be keeping count in your head, and that will drive you insane. On top of that, you probably also want to make it so the total distance traveled cannot be done in safe amounts. So for instance, you don't want every player to be able to just travel 5 feet per round and safely get there. You want to have a mix of safe distances versus unsafe distances to cause some really tense moments when they're rolling that dexterity saving throw, seeing if they're going to die. Aside from that, every character who makes it within the allotted time that, again, you decide will end up winning the game. Try to find a nice balance of distance to time spent. You should try to aim for something around 1 minute per each 30 feet the players have to travel. With red light, green light out of the way, we can move on to the third game in the list, which is Honeycombs. So in the show, Honeycombs is where players had to get into 4 separate lines, picking one of 4 shapes, either a circle, a triangle, a star, or an umbrella. The players would then have to carve the shape they chose out of a treat, a honeycomb treat, without the shape cracking or breaking, which if the shape cracked or braked, they were killed on sight. The players have to do this within the allotted time. If they fail to do so when the time ran out, also killed. So the nature of the Honeycombs game is very simple. Players will have to be making a series of sleight of hand checks, dexterity sleight of hand checks, equal to the numbers of points the shape has. So if you had them carve a circle, they would only make 1 check, as there's only 1 shape for them to carve through. If it was a triangle, they would have to make 3 checks to carve each side of the triangle. A square would have 4 checks, etc. Pretty simple, right? But you, as the GM, can reduce the DC the more checks there are, or you can just keep them uniform if you want it to go hard mode. But I think watching a player have to make 20 sleight of hand checks with a DC of something like 5 would still be equally as intense, as they'll be likely sweating the entire time just for that one unlucky roll that they might make. Failing a skill check causes the shape to crack, the player dies. The only tip I would give when creating your own Honeycombs game is to think of some really creative shapes for the players to try to carve out, and absolutely get them to role play yourself as they carve it out. The sweat that goes off of their brow while they're slowly, just like Ehun in the show, just when he's trying to carve it out, the sweat hits the pan, etc., etc. You can make this a very intense moment for the players, even though it is a very simple game. That is a tip pretty much for all of these, is it is your job as the GM to make this intense. Role play everything out that's going on around them. Make them feel the consequences that will happen if they manage to fail any one of these games. With that out of the way, we will move on to the fourth game in the show, which is Tug of War. So all of the remaining players, those who haven't died yet, are split into two teams in a battle of who can pull the other team's end of rope off the edge with them attached to it. In the show, when a winning team pulled a losing team off the edge, a falling guillotine would cut the rope, causing them to plummet to their deaths. So for this Tug of War game, it's going to be a little bit more complicated than what we've seen so far, but just bear with me here. Every player on each team will have to make an athletics check and combine their results. Whichever team has the higher total score will move the rope one notch in their direction. Again, play this on a game board so you have an idea of how far each party has to travel before they end up falling off of the cliff. And you, the GM, of course, decides how many notches they need to win. I would recommend something between like 5 to 7. So here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. If you'll remember in the show, Gi-hoon's team came up with some strategies that are used in the game of Tug of War thanks to the old man telling them how to basically win the game, meaning that there are multiple ways you can influence the game via decision making. With that in mind, before each round, each team will decide in secret whether they want to pull, lock, or give. This is like a round of rock, paper, scissors, but it's a team-based round of rock, paper, scissors. Pulling is the normal shuffle method seen in the show. Locking represents the leaning back method where you just lock yourself in position and lean back, giving yourself more leverage over the rope. And giving represents the strategy that Sung-woo used to win the game for his team, where he gave up ground to cause the other team to fall over, letting them fall off the cliff. So in this specific game of rock, paper, scissors, pulling will always beat giving, giving will always beat locking, and locking will always beat pulling. If the teams choose lock and pull, the team that chose lock gets advantage on their athletics check, as the other team pulling just haphazardly will have a much more difficult time pulling the rope than the team that decided to lock their position in. If the teams choose pull and give, the team that gives automatically loses one notch to the pulling team, as the pulling team is not putting themselves in a disadvantageous position if the other team were to, say, drop the rope. If the teams choose lock and give, the locking team stumbles and falls, awarding the giving team one notch as they pull back without resistance. I hope you're still with me. I'm sorry if this sounds complicated. If both teams end up choosing the same tactic, nothing special happens and each team just rolls their athletics checks as normal, and the first team to win the total number of notches required pulls the other team over the edge, causing them to plummet to their deaths. Moving on to the fifth game in the show, we have marbles. So if you remember in the show, players are split into teams of 2, given a set of 10 marbles with the goal of acquiring their opponent's marbles by whatever means they see fit, if that would be through games, deception, etc. The only rule is they cannot use violence to acquire their opponent's marbles. So to start, the GM will decide how many marbles each player start with. I would recommend either 10 or 20. So for this specific game, we will be sticking with the 2 games shown in the show, but feel free to come up with your own ideas. However, these rules will stay the same. So for the game odd or even, you'll remember in the show that one player holds a random amount of marbles in their hand. The other player must guess whether the number they are holding is odd or even. If they guess right, the player forfeits their marbles equal to the amount the guesser wagered. If they lose, then the guesser has to give the marbles they wagered to the person who is hiding the marbles. So for this game of odd or even, for D&D specifically, one player will take their D10 or D20, depending on how many marbles you have left, of course, and they will turn it to their chosen number, keeping it a secret. The other player must guess if the number is odd or even. If they guess right, the player who chose the number must forfeit their marbles equal to the number of marbles wagered by the guesser, just like in the show. If they guess wrong, the guesser must forfeit the amount of marbles wagered, just like in the show. Simple concept. If you start with 20 marbles, you'll start with a D20, and as you get down lower and lower, once you cross the threshold of 10, the player who is trying to hide the amount of marbles they're holding will then go to a D10 instead of a D20. In the end, doesn't really matter, just makes things more thematically appropriate. Moving on to the throwing game, the one that the gangster used with his lackey. Players must attempt to throw marbles into a small hole in the ground. Whoever throws a marble into the hole successfully collects all of the marbles on the ground that didn't make it in. So for how you would play this game, both players will make a combined skill check of dexterity and wisdom for the throw. The GM will set the total DC, which should be pretty high given the stakes of just 1 and collecting all, and whoever ends up collecting the full amount of marbles from the other player first, of course, wins. Now, as an optional rule, just like in the show, how the gangster won off of a technicality, of his lackey throwing a marble, it hitting the gangster's marble, knocking that one in, you could make a rule where a single natural one in the skill check or double natural ones in the skill check will cause one player to knock another player's marble into the hole, inadvertently giving them the win, the other player the win. I can definitely see that causing some fights at the table. Moving on, we have glass stepping stones, and this is the point in the show where the games turn from a fair test of skill to a complete guessing game, and we will oblige as such. So in the show, players must cross a deep chasm by jumping across a bridge of glass stepping stones. There are 2 panes of glass on each jump. One panel of glass is tempered and safe to jump on. The other is regular glass, which will break and the person will fall when they jump on it. Now for this game, I made 2 possible options for a GM to run this game. The first one being the easiest explanation, the glass panels are predetermined. You, the GM, will just make a bridge, decide which one is safe and which one is not, making it a pure 50-50 game of chance for the first person to cross each jump. And of course, when the first person jumps, and if it doesn't break, the rest of the players will probably know which one is safe. But maybe the stress level is too high. Maybe if a player isn't paying attention, you have them roll a perception check or some sort of wisdom check to try to remember which one is safe. That's how you can catch some less active players in the game. But regardless, the game at the start is a 50-50 game of chance for the first person to cross each part of the jump. Now, there's another way you can run this, in which involves the first person making each jump, the first person to get to each segment of the bridge, roll a d20. On a 1 through 10 on the die, the glass breaks and is revealed to be normal glass. On an 11 through 20, the glass is revealed to be the tempered glass. Basically, the first player making each jump is going to decide if it's safe or not for all the future players. But the choice is up to you. Alternatively, a player could make an acrobatics check to walk across the bars holding each of the glass panes, as seen in the show. Surprised nobody tried doing that in the show. However, the DC will increase the further away from the other side the player is. So if, say, a player just wants to go all the way from one side to the other, they basically would have to roll the highest possible DC, which if everyone's a commoner would be 20. They'd basically have to roll a natural 20 to completely skip the game, but anything lower than that, they die. It's just a possible way to skate around the rules of the game, and you could award your players some creativity with that. And of course, players who incorrectly or fail to do the acrobatics check successfully fall to their deaths. And moving on to the 7th and final game of the show, the game's moniker itself, Squid Game. So both in the show and in our version, first, players must divide into 2 teams. If it's a 1 versus 1 like in the show, there's offense and defense. However, if there are more than 2 players, you just split them into an equal number for each team. Each team will then play rock, paper, scissors to decide who will play offense and who will play defense. You could also do a coin toss, but regardless, the winner of the game will decide which one to play. The offense will start at the head of the squid, while the defense is going to be waiting inside the body. The area outside the shape is considered offense territory, and the inside of the shape is considered defense territory. The offense must hop on 1 foot from the point where they start all the way to the midpoint here, and the offense will win by escaping the defense at the midway point, shown there, then gaining the ability to use both feet, which will then allow them to enter the squid's body here, and they must combat the defense until reaching the squid's head over here. The defense wins when each member of the offense team gets disqualified, when all of them are counted out, and a player can be disqualified when a player steps on the line, or a player uses 2 feet before they're allowed to do so, or a player is pushed into the opponent's territory. So if the defense happens to push one of the offense players as they cross the midpoint out of bounds, they are disqualified. So now for the D&D variant. To start, the offense players jumping on 1 foot will make a contested acrobatics check versus a defense player's athletics check. If the offense wins, they successfully make the jump without getting pushed and can move on to the next part. If they fail, they are pushed out of bounds and DQ'd, killed immediately. On a success, the offense will then circle around to the back of the squid and prepare for phase 2. So, phase 2 involves the offense competing in a skill challenge against the defense. Once again, the offense and defense will make contested athletics checks for the offense to gain a foothold inside of the squid's body here. From there begins a series of contested skill checks for the offense to gain ground or the defense to push them out. Very similar to the Tug of War game, except this time you can get a lot more creative with it. as aside from that, the game can be handled in whatever way you see fit. The game ends if the offense makes it to the head of the squid, if all players on either team are pushed out of bounds, or all players on either team are unable to continue playing, and the losing players die. Now, the Squid Game is the hardest one to D&Dify, as there are so many moving parts involved in this game. It's kind of hard to just place rules on it and make it tabletop worthy, which is why I strongly suggest just using skill checks and making your own role play out of each one. As we see in the show, it is a very climactic moment, and I believe you as the GM can make it equally as climactic in your own personal flair. So, those are all of the rules of D&D Squid Game. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Meta, I can just point by my way into 20 strength, 20 dex, and 20 wisdom because you didn't have any of the players use any of their skill checks. Why would I point by into literally anything else? Well, listen here, Power Gamer. So, as the GM, it is your responsibility to make this interactive. This is not just like D&D, we don't always follow all of the rules to a T. You can also make exceptions. You can reward players who, say, put a lot of points into intelligence or into charisma. If you have a high intelligence character, maybe they know how to play the game before the others do, and maybe that gives them advantage on certain roles. Or maybe you have somebody who built high charisma to role play a lot, and maybe you reward them by giving them things kind of like in the show, how the doctor was able to know the games beforehand and get rewards, get extra food, because he was able to convince the soldiers of his usefulness. Maybe a high charisma character would be able to, just like Gi-hun and Song-woo at the end of the game, maybe the high charisma character convinces one of the soldiers to give him a knife or something, to give him advantage in the Squid Game. Because remember, the Squid Game rules say if a player is unable to continue, just like in the show, then they are considered disqualified. So this becomes an issue of power gaming versus roleplay strong characters. As the GM, it is your job, however you see fit, to reward your players for their creative choices if they are doing a point buy character. If you end up doing a commoner style character, then literally doesn't matter what you do, as this game was balanced around. But with point buy characters, or maybe even your own D&D party, you can have a lot of fun with this. The possibilities of a composition of characters are endless, and your group will have so much fun with this, I guarantee it. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is D&D Squid Game. I hope you enjoyed this. If you like these rules, want to try it for yourself, go grab them. Go join my Discord, grab these rules, go get a group together, and have some fun with it. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video right here, gold star for you. Thank you so much. I know I said in the last video 2 months ago that I was going to start uploading regularly, and then I didn't. But we're back for sure this time. And to prove it, here's some teasers of future stuff I got coming up on this channel. I will address everything over the last 2 months in a future piece of content or a live stream. On this channel, perhaps. Maybe we'll do our first ever live stream. I don't know. But if you guys enjoyed yourselves, be sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't. We're back. And as always, happy gaming.